Hello everyone and welcome back to the office for COM 350 summer session, and we are going into week 4, which means at the end of this week we will be halfway through this course. Now, what are we doing this week and what's going to be different next week? This week, by the end of the week, you will have taken your first exam, and I'd like to remind you that that is available for you right now. You could take it at your convenience anytime before 11:59 p.m. on Friday night. And it is listed under assessments and quizzes, because apparently we do not have exams or tests in this course. We only have quizzes, which is fine. It's a nice word. But this would be a pretty big quiz. It's worth 150 points as indicated on your syllabus, and it is short answer and multiple choice only, as I told you it would be. And it only covers the subjects that up until last Friday we covered. So hopefully that helps you out. Now, what's happening in the course of the next week and the subsequent 3 weeks after that is going to be a greater number of theorists, but we're going to go over them more quickly. What the past 4 weeks has done, or will have done by the time we finish it this week, is give you the groundwork and the basis for what you need for the rest of the semester. You have studied now the classical Greeks, Romans, and we're going to finish off with the medieval today, and that will set the table for what's coming in the next couple of weeks as we wrap up the course. So I hope you understand why we go so far in depth in the beginning, and then we just sort of use that as our sort of springboard for the other theorists that we're going to talk about by the end of the semester. So the good news is this long, dredged out, super detailed dig into the classical theorists is coming to an end, and sort of the more, let's say, not shallow necessarily, but more superfluous read of the following theorists up through until today. Those will come quickly. They will require far less specifics, detail, and some of it has heavy reading, but not nearly as difficult as what you've suffered through already, so no need to worry about that. Okay, so the last time that we talked, when we wrapped up our exam number 1 subject area, we left off at the end of the Roman Empire. Now, as you may know, I am not a history professor, but as we leave the Roman Empire for the Holy Roman Empire, the structure of who is in power changes. And who comes to power? The Roman Catholic Church. So literally becomes the Western world only, becomes a theocracy in a lot of ways. And it is the Roman Catholic Church that makes this happen. And I just want to say at the outset, I was born into the Roman Catholic Church, and I'm all way too familiar with it. If you were, you are very familiar with it as well. For those of you who were not raised in that tradition, I promise you that you won't be missing anything as we go through. I will tell you what you need to know from here on out. So I'm not going to make any assumptions about your knowledge of history, particularly during the medieval period, because not a lot of people really understand what was going on. The medieval period can cover anywhere from 800 years to 1600. So if you think about it, we're studying about 2,800 years, and half of that, up to half of that, might be time in the medieval period, depending on how you define it and what historical perspective you take. So this is a chunk of things. The bad news is that we don't have a whole heck of a lot of material to work with. And there's many reasons for that, and I'll get into those here in a minute. So what was going on sort of socially and economically during the medieval period? Well, we were going through sort of an understanding of the world that there was one entity in charge, and that one entity was the Roman Catholic Church, thereby making us a completely Christian world, right, in the Western hemisphere. Now, Not everybody fell in line with that. It is extremely understudied what else was going on at the time period. And I feel guilty about that because I know it was some of my predecessors who did that. And it's not a great thing that happened because it cut off progression in science, discovery, education, even in the arts. If you think about it, writing was for the Bible, art was for the Bible, science did not need to exist. And progress in education did not need to go further than the Bible. Now, I'm telling you what they were thinking at this time, they being those who were in charge and writing the history books, okay? At the same time, in the Eastern world, they were developing different ways of thinking that ultimately were suppressed by those in the Western Hemisphere, and we used our beliefs to establish or reestablish democracies and allow the church to influence us a little too much, if you ask me. That's a personal opinion right there, so don't write that down. But what we do know is that at the time in the Western world, the Roman Catholic Church told everybody that God was the only truth that there was. Their God was the only truth that there was. Their Christian God was the only truth that there was. So you did not need to go any further than asking God and talking to God and looking at the Bible to really know the answer to any question. This meant that there didn't need to be any scientific discovery because we already knew the truth, because God told us the truth. So we didn't need to look further than that. We didn't need anything more artistic than the church, than what the church provided for us. And so at the time, you might, if you've been to a medieval fair, which some of us have, I've been more to Renaissance fairs, but medieval fairs, they have these little like morality plays going on that were based on the Bible. That was a very traditional way for people to make money during the medieval times. Also, during the medieval period was an economic system known as the feudal system. The feudal system was based on the kings and queens who had princes and princesses, who had those who went to court, who had lords and ladies that served knights. And those knights, or the lords and ladies, they owned land. And they needed people to work that land, to get the vegetables for the kingdom, to provide the wheat and the flour and so on for the king and the queen and for the rest of the kingdom. These little plots of land were actually quite large. And so you might have, I don't know how many, I'm not even going to guess how many servants or what they called serfs, S-E-R-F as in Frank, S as in snake, serfs on the land. And you and your family would take a little portion of this land and you would work it and you would give all of it to your lord, except that which you were allowed to eat yourself. This was an incredibly impoverished way of living. Some people never even got off of their fiefdom, as we used to call them. They never got off of their fief because they were too busy working, and they never even went to town or market. That was a job for the women to go and shop so that they could bake and they could cook or whatnot. All of this in service to the lord or knight that held their land and property, and they held that land and property in service to the king and queen. Okay. Literally generations of families never left that little piece of land. So you were born into it, and you might stay there, not just for your life, but for your children's lives, for your grandchildren's lives. We're talking about, centuries of working for the same lord, for the same knight, for the same king. Now, were there little shifts and changes in there? Absolutely. But outside influence was not needed according to them, but more importantly, outside influence was not allowed, because outside influence was an influence from something other than the truth, something other than God. As you're listening to this, you might be able to figure out that there was really no room in this world for rhetoric, right? Because whether it searched for truth or changed the truth or modified the truth or tried to persuade or influence in some way, none of that was necessary during the medieval times. This is why they're often called the Dark Ages, by the way, because there was no discovery, there was no sharing of knowledge and information, there was no difference in truth. That meant there was no reason for debate. And during this time period, the church actually did say that rhetoric was bad. Why was rhetoric bad? Well, there's a number of reasons for this. One reason was that it was practiced by pagans, right? Because the classical Romans and the classical Greeks are pre-Christianity, and they were, they were a people of many gods, not no gods and not one god, but many gods, I guess. And that pagan practice was considered evil. Also, number two, and this is kind of a big one, the first entity in the Bible. I'm going to debate this a little bit with myself, because a lot of people say the first entity to use rhetoric in the Bible was the serpent. Okay? Now, some people say Lucifer, some people say Satan, some people say the devil. I'm just going to say the serpent, the snake. And the reason for that is because it doesn't really matter which way you think about that snake. The snake represents evil, the opposite of God, right, at the time. And the way that he used rhetoric was to seduce Eve into biting from the tree of knowledge. So you can see the reputation for rhetoric here was really, really not good. It was being used by the serpent for the purpose of leading man to downfall. And how did he get to the downfall? And I'm using that term man because it is in fact exclusive in my opinion. How did we get to that downfall of man, quote unquote, is because of the rhetoric of the serpent and taking a bite from the tree of knowledge. Think about that for a second. That suggested that knowledge was a horrible thing. You didn't need it and you shouldn't look for it. The third reason why rhetoric was seen as bad was because it was seen as a money-making and self-providing practice. Now, there were sophists at the time, and they were considered pagans, and they were not well loved, but they still made money, because no matter what, there were always land disputes to settle that people needed a lawyer or a negotiator for, so they would call a sophist to either be taught or to have them speak for them. Again, your teachers and your lawyers. The fourth reason why rhetoric was considered evil, and this is actually one that I 100% agree with, is it is a sign of pride. Okay? Now, to the medieval era, pride, of course, being the deadliest sin that you could commit according to the Catholic Church, according to that time period of belief, pride was the worst of the sins. Pride was what came before you fell. Pride was what led Lucifer to fall. Pride is what makes you believe that you're better than God. Okay? And that was considered bad. So that exercise, and the reason I say I agree with it is because a lot of times when you see public speakers and they're enjoying themselves, or they seem to be happy doing the speech, or they feel good, it's because It's having pride in your product. It's having pride in your work, right? The last reason why rhetoric was considered evil was because, and this is a little weird, so I apologize, but it was because it aroused the passions, was how they said it. Now, you could look at this as it would get people excitable and they wouldn't think very clearly, or they would forget their God or their Christian principles, or you could look at it as more of the sexual idea of arousal, that rhetoric, the practice of rhetoric, made you feel so powerful and so prideful that you would somehow find that to be exciting. Personally, that's not one I see. But I believe it. I believe they thought it. Let's put it that way. I'm not sure I agree with that far of an interpretation. So I said that I would talk about the serpent, which I think was my point number 2. And I said that rhetoric was in the Bible first used by the serpent. And I said I was going to disagree with that. And that is here. So if you're not familiar with the Bible, the story that we get told about the creation of the earth is that God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Now, think about that for a second. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. That idea of the word creating things. In this case, the distinction between light and dark. The power of the word is extremely important in the Bible, which means the power of rhetoric to influence is actually defined in a way in the Bible as one of the most powerful things that God, in this case, could do. That sort of suggests to us that if we start to think that anything we say can just come true, then we think we're better than God. So you could see how they thought that this would be evil. And from that perspective, I obviously don't agree. But you can see how people like to take these justifications for why rhetoric is bad. And of course, the serpent, who is he? He's Satan, he's the devil, he's Lucifer, he's whoever you want to call him. He's a liar. That's the biggest thing that we know about the devil, or that I should say that we're taught in Catholic school at least, is that Lucifer was a liar. Okay? So if Lucifer was a liar and he was the first one to use rhetoric, if you buy all that, then rhetoric is nothing but lies. So do I take this personally? A little bit, but I doubt I need to. So those are the reasons why rhetoric was viewed as evil. So the question becomes, well, what are we studying then? What do we do during the medieval times? Well, there's a couple of things that were going on at the same time that are very important. First, and I don't want to get this wrong, but I believe it was Islamic monks who preserved the classical works of the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, because what did the church want to do with them? Burn them all down. The library at Alexandria, anybody? Completely destroyed. Original works taken, burned, destroyed, lost forever to us. And at the time, the Eastern influence was don't get rid of anything. They had a deep respect for history in the world. And so they preserved some of those for us. And thank goodness, otherwise we might not have a lot of the access to things that we do today. So it's thanks to them that we are able to know what the classical Greeks and Romans were talking about. Now, could they save everything? No, of course not. But did they try? I'm sure they did. They preserved enough that we now know what that contrast or what that sort of pivotal argument was about. Remember how I said in ancient Greece, the debate was really about rhetoric versus philosophy or rhetoric versus truth? And then during the classical Roman period, it was really about rhetoric versus power. Well, during the medieval period, we're looking at the relationship between rhetoric and the church. That argument between whether or not rhetoric is evil, whether or not it is God-given, whether or not it is a gift, or it is something that is used only for evil purposes. All of those things are coming into play here during the medieval period. So it's important to keep that sort of in mind as we're reading and talking about these particular individuals. There's really only two individuals, during the medieval period proper that we're going to address. The first one is Augustine, and the second one is, wow, her name just left, because I'm going to say Margaret Fell, and that's not who I mean. Christine de Pizan, there we go. Christine de Pizan is obviously, if you go by traditional gender roles at the time, her name was in fact feminine. She was a female who wrote, and you're going to be asking me, how is that possible during this time when women were sort of hidden away and scurried away and had no power? We're going to talk about that because not everything happens fully as a black and white experience, right? During this time, there were some queens and princesses who had a lot of power and influence. There were some women who were learned. They were taught, mainly because they lived with the kings and the queens in the palaces, and therefore were taught just like the princes and princesses were. And so when we talk about Christine de Pizan, we'll talk about that. A very different view is going to come from Augustine, and yes, that is Saint Augustine, depending on whichever way you call him, I don't really care, or Augustine, that's another way to pronounce it, okay? So he obviously at some point became a Christian, but he didn't start out that way. In fact, it wasn't until far later in life that he decided to adopt Christianity. He was born to a Christian mother and a pagan father. And that pagan father wasn't really around, but Augustine felt that he should be able to follow those footsteps. That was the path he chose. And the story goes, all I can tell you is that this is in the Roman Catholic history. The story is that Monica, who was his mother, prayed for him to become a Christian every single day. And I don't know if he did before she died or not, but she became Saint Monica because that was her miracle here on earth, was that Augustine somehow converted. Before he converted, he lived a life of gluttony and lust and power and pride. He was a sophist who traveled from Tagaste, which is in Africa, up into the different parts of the Roman Empire. And he practiced sophistry. Along the way, he had a woman companion, a female companion, not a wife. He never married, but they had a child together. Unfortunately, his child and his partner both died very young, and so we don't know anything about them really, to be honest. But some people say, well, that played into his shift to Christianity. Okay, that's fine. But how did he still practice rhetoric once he became a Christian? Because he had to give up all of these vices, according to the Catholic Church, that he had in order to become a Christian. And in fact, the only Christians that were really being taught, aside from the kings and queens and the courtiers, were the monks. So he actually did go to a monastery when he decided to practice in the church. How did he pull that off? Well, there's a couple of things that Augustine wrote that I'm going to tell you about, but you're not going to have to read them. First things first, Augustine loves the sound of his own voice when he's writing. I don't know how else to put that. I imagine him being extremely verbose. He wrote a lot, and so there's something like 5 or 6 volumes of On Christian Doctrine, which I believe I'm having you read just a little snippet of that. There's not that much there. But he first wrote a book called Confessions. And in Confessions, he talks about everything that he did in his life that he now perceives to be a sin, a mistake, stuff he shouldn't have been doing. But one of those was not the practice of rhetoric. Now, it was incredibly hard for him to defend having practiced rhetoric when he joined the church. So in On Christian Doctrine, there's an entire volume, and again, you're not going to be reading this, you're reading a small snippet, but there's an entire volume dedicated to the practice of rhetoric in the church. That is what we are going to focus on, and that is what we are going to read. Augustine wanted to give people in the church, Christians, an understanding of how to use rhetoric appropriately. So how does he do that? Well, first he says, whatever you do, know this, I am not talking about rhetoric. And then he says, let's define rhetoric. So kind of silly, really, when you think about it, but again, a rhetorical device that you use to persuade so that people didn't just say, oh, you're going to talk about rhetoric, I'm not reading that because we don't believe in that. That's evil, that's pagan, that's bad. He had to get his readers to actually engage with the concept of rhetoric. So how does he get around these problems with rhetoric? Well, let's go through them. Rhetoric was evil because it was used by Lucifer. Okay, probably true, he says. He says probably true. But even if that's the case, we need to use rhetoric, meaning Christians, to fight against Satan. Okay? So if Satan is using rhetoric on us, the church should be able to use rhetoric to fight back. How silly is it to think that you wouldn't use the same device against evil for the purpose of good? He also says that rhetoric has purposes in the church. And I'm going to have you read these purposes, but they are to, in some, and please do read the descriptions because it's important that you do, to teach, to preach, and to convert, okay? And he says that those three have different jobs. Teaching means telling people who don't know about Christianity. When you're preaching, you're doing it to please, to make people feel good about being a part of Christianity. And the last part, to convert, is when you're trying to persuade people to join Christianity, to become a part of the church. Now, those three goals for rhetoric, he says, also require different styles of delivery. He loved Cicero. And how do you justify, in his case as a Catholic or as a Christian, how do you justify loving a pagan theorist? Well, you turn it into using their ideas for good. In this case, for the church. So he had these three different levels of style that he chose, the grand, the common, and the middle, and he assigned them to the purpose of to teach, to preach, and to convert. And in teaching, we really see that as an informing sort of job. In preaching, we see that as pleasing to the ear, preaching to the choir. You've heard that, maybe you've heard that phrase before. If you've heard the phrase preaching to the choir, this literally means you're already telling people who agree with you what you think and why you think it. And it's like, you're preaching to the choir, man, I agree with you, right? And when you have a bunch of believers, he said, you have to keep them entertained and happy and still believing in what you're preaching. And therefore, it must be pleasing to them, what you say. Finally, conversion is persuasion, right? And if you're going to persuade, you need the tools given to you by rhetoric in order to persuade. Okay, so what about that whole truth problem then? That was our first issue with rhetoric. The first reason that it is evil is because it hides the truth or pulls us away from the truth. How do we get around that one? Well, he says it's very easy. Anytime you practice rhetoric, before you do it, there is one thing you need to do. And that for him was to pray. If you prayed, then God would inspire you with the truth that you should then share with your audience. So that whole thing where we gather data and evidence and we put it together and we create a well-reasoned argument, forget all that. Invention is a piece of cake if you're a Christian here in the medieval period, because all you have to do is pray and you'll know what to say. And he says if you don't pray before you practice rhetoric, that you were going to potentially fall into the trap of using rhetoric for evil means. Okay, you see how this gets played out? So how do we keep ourselves from falling into the sin of pride? By making sure we pray first. That solves all those problems, apparently. I'm not sure I agree with that. You can see I'm a little bit skeptical. But if you're a person who believes that God could tell you what to say and that is where you find truth and that is where you get your power and that is what you acknowledge as the higher power above you, then that would solve all of those other problems that rhetoric in pagan times created. I hope that makes sense. And he says, of course you should be excited to practice rhetoric. You should be excited to share the word of God and of Jesus. So that's okay. It's all right if you're excited and happy and proud of your performance because God told you what to say. Just don't think that you're better than he is. That's the rule. And that is how he worked in the church, utilizing rhetoric for its purposes. This didn't go over really, really well, but it is one of the doctrines that has lasted. And I have seen a lot of works written on this in the Catholic Church. It's something that priests, in the Catholic Church they're called priests, right, or your pastor. It's something that they study, how to give a good sermon. By the way, most of them are not great at it, right? I don't know if any of you have had the experience of going to a Catholic service, but, well, even our weddings are a little drawn out in my opinion, right? But I have yet to meet a really, truly exciting priest who can deliver a really good sermon. Now, I've seen several pastors from other churches and all sorts of denominations who have given fantastic sermons. Again, all opinion. But this is something that a lot of people in the church, no matter what church, not just the Catholic Church anymore, but all of them study to find out how is it I'm going to persuade, how is it I'm going to please, how is it I am going to teach my flock, right? So, in that sense, it really gives a lot of people a way of utilizing a tool that was considered evil to use it for good. Again, this is during the medieval period, okay? At some point towards the end of the medieval period into the early Renaissances, this will shift and change, I promise. So, what you're doing this week is you are reading about Augustine specifically, and there are things I want you to look for. I want you to look for his three three uses, there we go, of rhetoric in the church: to preach, to teach, and to persuade. I want you to look at the three levels of style that he associates with those. I want you to understand that he says that in order to find truth, you don't go through some invention process of reasoning, but you pray, and that's how you get the knowledge that you need. And it's really interesting. I used to put this, I don't know, I think the editors of the book, I'm sorry, Be Kind, Rewind, I'll start that sentence for the fourth time. I don't think in the version of the book that you have online, and that I have, I'm using it now, has this. But at the end of this incredibly long treatise that we have from Augustine, he spends about 6 very long paragraphs telling us, I enjoyed writing this. If you did not enjoy reading this, that's your problem. You should go back and reread it again because you missed something. If you don't understand it, that's because you're not smart enough to understand it. If you didn't enjoy it, you should read it again anyway for the purpose of being able to find joy in it. If you did enjoy it, you should read it again anyways because it was enjoyable. I mean, it is just this long epilogue of just absolute, here's why my writing is so great. And I always found that kind of ironic coming from the person who is trying to say, don't believe that you are above God or awesome, or that it is you that this comes from, because he just spent literal volumes of work telling us that you should give that to God. And you know, I don't think we put that in the end, but I will put it this way. Augustine's works tend to have an epilogue of not an apology, not an explanation, but a description that if you didn't like the work, that's your fault, not his. Which is humorous in a lot of ways, and I find to be instructive in other ways. But that's for a different class. So I'm going to cut it off there. Those are the things I want you to look for when you're reading this work by Augustine. And I will come back on Thursday, I'm hoping. My husband is having surgery tomorrow, which is Tuesday, which is why I am recording this tonight, Monday. But I should be back with you Wednesday night or Thursday morning to talk about Christine de Pizan. And I will see you all then. I'm looking forward to it. In the meantime, I hope you will start to find some enjoyment or at least ease in reading what we're going to be reading going forward, because it's going to go, as I said, very quickly. We're going to cover a lot of material, very many theorists, and we'll move all the way from the medieval period into our current modern times. All right, everybody, I will talk to you soon.